My son Vincent grabbed my walking cane right out of my hands and threw it aside. "Use your legs or stay down, Mom," he said with disgust. I was 70 years old, recovering from hip surgery. But I stood up anyway. By sunset that day, I had walked 3 miles to my lawyer's office and rewritten my entire will. 6 months later, when Vincent came looking for his inheritance, all he found was an empty house and a forwarding address he'd never be given. This isn't a story about revenge, it's about a woman who learned that sometimes the people who push you down are exactly the ones who teach you how to stand. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in this beautiful world you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and second chances. I'm Dorothy. Morrison, though. Most folks in Willowbrook Valley just call me Mrs. Morrison, the way they've been doing for the past 47 years. At 70, with silver hair that I still curl every Sunday morning and hands that remember every piano lesson I ever taught, I thought I knew exactly who I was supposed to be at this stage of life. Grateful, quiet, and above all, not a burden to my children. My late husband Robert always said I had too much pride for my own good. He'd tell me while we sat on our front porch swing, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, "You don't always have to carry everything yourself." He was right, of course. Robert usually was, but carrying things myself had gotten me through 60 years of marriage, 4 children, and 2 miscarriages that nearly broke my heart. It had gotten me through Robert's slow decline from emphysema and the terrible quiet that followed his funeral. Pride, it turned out, was all I had left, until the morning my son Vincent decided it was too much. Our house sits on Maple Ridge Road, a winding street lined with oak trees that Robert planted when we first moved here in 1977. Back then, this was considered the outskirts of Willowbrook Valley, far enough from town to have some peace. Close enough that I could drive to the grocery store or the elementary school where I taught 3rd grade for 32 years. Now, of course, the town has grown up around us. Shopping centers and subdivisions have sprouted where cornfields used to wave in the summer breeze. But our house, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch, remains exactly as it was, like a stubborn reminder of simpler times. I've always loved this house. Robert and I painted every room together, installed every light fixture, planted every rose bush in the garden. We raised Vincent, Patricia, David, and little Emma here. We celebrated birthdays and holidays, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and grew old together within these walls. Every creak of the floorboards tells a story. Every scuff mark holds a memory. But 3 months ago, when I slipped on the icy front steps and shattered my left hip, everything changed. The surgery went well, according to Dr. Fletcher at Willowbrook General Hospital. "You'll be good as new in no time, Mrs. Morrison," he assured me, his young face bright with the confidence that only comes from never having experienced a broken anything. "Just take it slow and use the walking aids we've provided." The walking aids? A polite way of saying I now needed a cane to get from my bedroom to the kitchen without my hip screaming in protest. I'd never needed help with anything before. Robert and I had always been fiercely independent, the kind of people who mowed our own lawn well into our 60s and drove ourselves to doctor's appointments until the day he couldn't anymore. The cane felt like a surrender, a white flag waved at age and circumstance. But Dr. Fletcher insisted, the physical therapist insisted, and eventually, I had to admit that it helped. The cane was nothing fancy, aluminum with a basic black handle and a rubber tip that squeaked slightly against the hardwood floors. But it was sturdy, reliable, and after a few weeks, it became as natural as carrying a purse. I even started to appreciate having something to lean on when my hip ached during the changing weather. My children, however, saw it differently. Vincent, my eldest at 48, had always been the serious one. Even as a little boy, he approached life like a business transaction, calculating risks, weighing outcomes, making practical decisions. He became an accountant, married Jennifer, a real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair and opinions about everything, and bought a large house in the newer part of town where all the successful young families lived. They had 2 children, Kyle, who was away at college, and Rachel, a high school senior who rarely looked up from her phone long enough to acknowledge my existence. Patricia lived in Denver now, busy with her career as a marketing executive. David had moved to Florida after his divorce, and Emma had been gone for 12 years. Taken by cancer at 36, leaving a hole in our family that never quite healed, so when I needed help after the surgery, it was Vincent who stepped up, not because he wanted to, I suspected, but because he was the only one close enough to do it. He and Jennifer started coming by twice a week ostensibly to check on me, but really to examine my house like inspectors looking for code violations. "Mom, this carpet is a tripping hazard," Jennifer would announce, running her manicured fingers along the edge of the Persian rug Robert and I had bought for our 20th anniversary. "The stairs are too steep," Vincent would add, shaking his head as he looked up toward the second floor where Robert and I had slept for decades, "and this kitchen needs updating. These cabinets are from the 70s. And that linoleum is probably full of asbestos." I tried to be patient. I told myself they were worried about me, that their concerns came from love, but every visit felt less like checking on my well-being and more like appraising my belongings. They spoke about my house, my life, my future, as if I weren't sitting right there, as if my opinions were no longer relevant now that I walked with a cane. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. The first crocuses were pushing through the soil in my front garden, purple and white blooms that had returned faithfully every spring for 20 years. I was in the kitchen, making my morning coffee and planning to spend the day going through some boxes in the attic. Robert's old tools were up there, along with photo albums and books I'd been meaning to donate to the church's annual rummage sale. With my hip finally feeling stronger, I thought it was time to tackle the project, but the attic ladder was steep and narrow, and I knew I couldn't manage it safely with my cane. So I called Vincent. "Could you help me bring down some boxes from the attic?" I asked when he answered the phone. "Nothing heavy, just some things I want to sort through." There was a pause. "Mom, you shouldn't be going through dusty old boxes. Why don't you just leave everything where it is?" "Because I want to donate Robert's tools to the church," I explained. "Pastor Williams mentioned they're building new shelters for the homeless ministry, and Robert would have loved knowing his tools were being put to good use." Another pause. "Longer this time. Jennifer and I will be over in an hour. We need to talk anyway." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. Vincent was busy with tax season at his accounting firm. He was probably just stressed. They arrived exactly 1 hour later, Vincent in his pressed khakis and button-down shirt. Jennifer in what I'd learned to recognize as her serious conversation outfit, a navy blazer over dark jeans and heels that clicked against my hardwood floors like a metronome. Neither of them looked toward the attic stairs. Instead, they sat me down at my own kitchen table. The kitchen had always been the heart of our home. It was where I'd packed thousands of school lunches, where Robert read the morning paper while I cooked breakfast, where our children did homework while I prepared dinner. The round oak table in the center had hosted family game nights, birthday celebrations, and countless conversations about everything from scraped knees to broken hearts. It was painted a warm yellow, sunshine walls, Robert called them, and every surface held memories. The small chip in the countertop from when David tried to crack walnuts with a hammer. The pencil marks on the doorframe where we'd measured each child's height, the ceramic cookie jar shaped like a rooster that Emma had given me for Mother's Day when she was 8. Now Vincent and Jennifer sat across from me at that familiar table, their faces wearing the expression people get when they're about to deliver news you don't want to hear. "Mom, we need to talk," Vincent began, using the same tone he'd employed when he was 12 and had broken Mrs. Peterson's window with a baseball. "Jennifer and I have been discussing your situation." My situation, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person making decisions about my own life. Jennifer leaned forward, her hands folded in what I recognized as her professional consultation pose, the one she probably used when convincing clients to sell houses they weren't ready to leave. "We're really worried about you living alone in this big house. What if you fall again? What if something happens and no one finds you for hours or days?" The fear in her voice sounded genuine, but there was something else underneath it. something that made me grip my cane a little tighter where it rested against my leg. "I have my medical alert button," I said, gesturing to the small device hanging around my neck, "and Mrs. Chen next door checks on me every day. Plus, my hip is healing well. Dr. Fletcher says I'm ahead of schedule." Vincent shifted in his chair, and I saw that familiar tightening around his eyes, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when I wouldn't let him quit piano lessons or skip church. "Mom, you're being optimistic, but you're not being realistic. Look at you. You can barely get around without that cane. You're isolated out here on this big property, and this house is falling apart around you." I looked around my kitchen, my beloved kitchen with its sunny walls and lifetime of memories. Falling apart, maybe the linoleum was showing its age. And perhaps the cabinets could use a fresh coat of paint, but the bones of this house were solid. Robert had made sure of that. "The house is fine," I said quietly. "And so am I." Vincent's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me so sharply of his father that my breath caught. But where Robert's stubbornness had always been tempered with kindness, Vincent's had an edge that made me uneasy. "Fine," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Mom, when's the last time you drove anywhere? When's the last time you went to the grocery store by yourself, or to church? Or anywhere that wasn't a doctor's appointment?" The question stung. Because they weren't entirely unfair. Since the hip surgery, I had been relying on others more than I liked. Vincent or Jennifer drove me to my physical therapy appointments. Mrs. Chen, bless her heart, had been picking up my groceries along with her own. And I hadn't been to Sunday service in over a month, partly because of the pain but mostly because I was embarrassed about walking so slowly with my cane. But admitting that felt like agreeing to surrender. "I'm still recovering," I said. "Dr. Fletcher says it takes time." "It's been 3 months, Jennifer interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "And the truth is, even before the surgery, you were becoming more isolated. You stopped having people over, stopped going to your book club, stopped doing a lot of the things you used to enjoy." That was true too, though I hadn't thought anyone had noticed. After Robert died, social activities had felt hollow, like going through motions without understanding the purpose. The book club ladies were kind, but their chatter about novels and grandchildren only emphasized how quiet my own house had become. Dinner parties seemed pointless when there was no one to share the cooking or laugh at my stories. I'd been content with solitude, or so I'd told myself. "We found a really nice place," Vincent continued, pulling a brochure from his jacket pocket. "Sunset Manor Assisted Living. It's only 20 minutes from our house. And they have wonderful programs, arts and crafts, game nights, even a book club. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be people around, activities to keep you engaged, and medical staff on site if you need anything." He slid the glossy brochure across the table. On the cover, a smiling elderly woman in a purple sweater sat at a table with other residents, all of them looking delighted to be playing what appeared to be bingo. The headline read, "Sunset Manor, where every day is a new beginning." I stared at the brochure without picking it up. Inside, I knew, would be photographs of sterile apartments with beige walls and standard issue furniture. There would be images of organized activities and scheduled meal times, of residents sitting in wheelchairs while staff members served them pureed food and spoke to them in unnaturally cheerful voices. It looked like a place where people went to wait. "I'm not ready for that," I said, pushing the brochure back toward him. "I'm managing just fine here." The silence that followed was thick with frustration. I could see Vincent and Jennifer exchanging glances, the kind of wordless communication that married couples develop over years of dealing with difficult situations. "Mom," Vincent said finally, his voice taking on the patience people use with children or the confused elderly, "you're not managing. You're surviving, barely. This house is too big, too isolated, and too much for someone in your condition. What happens when winter comes again? What happens if you fall on those front steps again, or in the shower, or going up to the bedroom?" Each question felt like a small hammer blow, chipping away at my confidence. Because the truth was, I did worry about those things. I did feel the weight of the empty rooms upstairs, the echo of my footsteps in halls that used to ring with children's laughter. I did notice how my hands shook slightly when I had to navigate the stairs, how my balance wasn't quite what it used to be. But this house was more than just shelter. It was the repository of everything I'd built with Robert, everything we'd been together. Leaving it would be like erasing 47 years of shared life. I understand your concerns, I said, choosing my words carefully, but I'm not ready to make such a big change. Maybe we could talk about some modifications to make the house safer. Grab bars in the bathroom, better lighting on the stairs. Vincent's patience finally snapped. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum with a harsh sound that made me flinch. In one swift motion, he reached over and yanked my cane from where it rested against my leg. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that I gasped. One moment my cane was there, a reassuring presence against my knee, and the next it was in Vincent's hand, held just out of my reach like a toy taken from a misbehaving child. "Use your legs or stay down, Mom," he said, his voice hard with frustration and something that might have been disgust. "Because this dependency isn't helping anyone. You're using that thing as a crutch, not just physically, but mentally. You've convinced yourself you can't function without it. Can't live independently, can't make decisions. But look at you right now. You're sitting up straight, you're thinking clearly, you're having a conversation. The only thing that cane is doing is giving you an excuse to avoid facing reality." Jennifer's face had gone pale. She reached out as if to touch Vincent's arm, but he stepped away from the table, still holding my cane like evidence in a trial. "Vincent," she said softly, "maybe we should." "No," he cut her off. "She needs to hear this. Mom, I love you. But I'm not going to enable this helplessness anymore. You have two choices. You can adapt to your limitations and move somewhere appropriate for your condition. Or you can continue pretending everything is fine while putting yourself at risk every single day." I sat there looking up at my son, this man I'd carried for 9 months, delivered after 18 hours of labor, nursed through countless childhood illnesses, taught to ride a bike and drive a car and treat people with kindness. He was holding my mobility hostage to make a point about my independence. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. But something was happening inside me as I sat there. Something that started as a flutter in my chest and grew into something stronger, more solid. Not anger, exactly, though there was certainly some of that. Not hurt, though that was there too. It was more like recognition, the sudden, crystal clear understanding that this moment was a test, not of my physical ability, but of something deeper. My entire adult life, I'd been someone who took care of others. I'd taught children to read, helped them navigate playground disputes and family troubles. I'd supported Robert through career changes and health scares. I'd raised 4 children, burying one and watching the others build lives in distant places. I'd been the one others leaned on, the problem solver, the steady presence in the storm. When had I become the problem to be solved? Slowly, carefully, I placed both hands flat on the table. The smooth oak surface felt solid beneath my palms, real and substantial. Like everything else in this kitchen that Robert and I had chosen together. I pressed down, feeling the strength in my arms, the stability in my core, the determination that had carried me through 7 decades of challenges. And then I stood up. It wasn't graceful. My hip protested with a sharp ache, and for a moment my balance wavered as I adjusted to standing without my usual support. But I rose from that chair under my own power, meeting Vincent's eyes as I straightened to my full height. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I don't need to depend on people who treat me like a burden." Vincent's expression shifted from triumph to uncertainty. He glanced down at the cane in his hand as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. I walked to the front door, each step deliberate and measured. My hip ached with every movement, but I kept going. Past the photographs on the hallway wall, pictures of Vincent's high school graduation, Patricia's wedding, David's children, Emma's last Christmas with us. Past the small table where Robert used to drop his keys every evening when he came home from work. Past the mirror where I'd checked my appearance before leaving for church every Sunday for 47 years. At the door, I turned the handle and pulled it open, letting in the cool March air and the scent of those faithful crocuses blooming in my garden. "I think you should leave now," I said. Vincent stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, my cane still in his hand. "Mom, we're trying to help you. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jennifer had risen from her chair, her face a mixture of embarrassment and concern. Maybe we could all just take a breath, and if the only thing that's hard, I interrupted, still holding the door open, is watching my son forget where he came from. For a moment, nobody moved. The three of us formed a tableau of family dysfunction, me at the door, Vincent clutching my cane like a weapon he didn't know how to put down. Jennifer caught between us with her hands raised in a gesture of placation. Then Vincent's jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. He walked to the living room and tossed my cane onto the couch like it was garbage, letting it bounce once before settling against the cushions. "We're trying to help you, Mom," he repeated, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "When you're ready to have a real conversation about your future, let us know." They left without another word, Vincent's shoulders rigid with righteous anger, Jennifer throwing apologetic glances over her shoulder as they walked to their car. I watched from the doorway as they drove away, Vincent's sedan disappearing around the curve where Maple Ridge Road bent toward town. Only then did I close the door and allow myself to lean against it, my hip throbbing and my heart racing from the confrontation. The house felt different now, not empty, but charged with possibility, like the air before a thunderstorm. I looked across the living room at my cane lying there on the couch cushions, not forgotten, not abandoned, just waiting, like a faithful friend who understood that sometimes you needed to prove you could walk alone before you chose to accept help. But something inside me wasn't waiting anymore. Something was already moving, already making plans, already reaching for the phone. On the side table, Hamilton and Associates law firm, a crisp voice answered on the second ring. "How may I help you?" "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'd like to schedule an appointment with Eleanor Hamilton today, if possible." "May I ask what this is regarding?" I looked around my living room at the family photos on the mantel. The Afghan Robert's mother had crocheted draped over his favorite chair, the piano where I'd taught my children to play chopsticks, and happy birthday. I thought about Vincent's ultimatum, about assisted living facilities and dependency, about the difference between needing help and surrendering control. "Estate planning," I said. "I need to make some changes to my will." After I hung up, I walked to the couch and picked up my cane. It felt lighter somehow, less like a burden and more like a tool, something I could choose to use or not use, depending on what I needed to accomplish. I had a 3-mile walk ahead of me to Eleanor Hamilton's office in downtown Willowbrook Valley. 3 miles through the neighborhood where I'd lived for half a century, past houses where I'd attended baby showers and funeral luncheons, past the elementary school where I'd shaped young minds for 32 years, past the church where Robert and I had been married and where we'd said goodbye to Emma. I opened my front closet and found my best walking shoes, the comfortable black ones with good support that I'd worn to Emma's funeral. I laced them carefully, double knotting them the way Robert had taught me when we went hiking in the mountains during our early marriage. Then I picked up my purse, checked that my driver's license and insurance cards were inside, and opened the front door again. The March air was crisp but not cold, carrying the promise of spring in its wake. My crocuses nodded in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of children playing in the elementary school playground. I stepped onto my front porch, pulled the door closed behind me, and started walking. For the first time in months, I was going somewhere that mattered. And for the first time since Robert died, I was going there entirely on my own terms. The walk to downtown Willowbrook Valley took me exactly 2 hours and 43 minutes. I know this because I checked my watch when I left Maple Ridge Road, and again when I reached the red brick building that housed Hamilton and Associates law firm on Cedar Street. 2 hours and 43 minutes of putting one foot in front of the other, my cane tapping a steady rhythm against the sidewalk, my hip protesting with each step but my resolve growing stronger with every block. I hadn't walked that far in one stretch since before Robert's illness, when we used to take evening strolls through the neighborhood after dinner. Back then, walking was pleasure, a chance to check on neighbors' gardens, wave to familiar faces, and share the comfortable silence that comes with 47 years of marriage. This walk was different. This walk had purpose. The route took me through the heart of Willowbrook Valley, past landmarks that marked the geography of my adult life. I walked by Riverside Elementary School, where the playground echoed with children's laughter and where I'd spent 3 decades shaping young minds. The building looked smaller than I remembered, somehow diminished by the newer additions and modern playground equipment that had replaced the simple swings and slides of my teaching years. Past the school, I continued down Oak Avenue, where the houses grew closer together and the lawns more manicured. These were the homes of Willowbrook Valley's newer residents, young families with 2-car garages and carefully landscaped yards that looked like magazine photos. I recognized a few. Vincent stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, my cane still in his hand. "Mom, we're trying to help you. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jennifer had risen from her chair, her face a mixture of embarrassment and concern. Maybe we could all just take a breath, and if the only thing that's hard," I interrupted, still holding the door open, "is watching my son forget where he came from." For a moment, nobody moved. The 3 of us formed a tableau of family dysfunction, me at the door, Vincent clutching my cane like a weapon he didn't know how to put down. Jennifer caught between us with her hands raised in a gesture of placation. Then Vincent's jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. He walked to the living room and tossed my cane onto the couch like it was garbage, letting it bounce once before settling against the cushions. "We're trying to help you, Mom," he repeated, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "When you're ready to have a real conversation about your future, let us know." They left without another word, Vincent's shoulders rigid with righteous anger, Jennifer throwing apologetic glances over her shoulder as they walked to their car. I watched from the doorway as they drove away, Vincent's sedan disappearing around the curve where Maple Ridge Road bent toward town. Only then did I close the door and allow myself to lean against it, my hip throbbing and my heart racing from the confrontation. The house felt different now, not empty, but charged with possibility, like the air before a thunderstorm. I looked across the living room at my cane lying there on the couch cushions, not forgotten, not abandoned, just waiting, like a faithful friend who understood that sometimes you needed to prove you could walk alone before you chose to accept help. But something inside me wasn't waiting anymore. Something was already moving, already making plans, already reaching for the phone. On the side table, Hamilton and Associates law firm, a crisp voice answered on the second ring. "How may I help you?" "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'd like to schedule an appointment with Eleanor Hamilton today, if possible." "May I ask what this is regarding?" I looked around my living room at the family photos on the mantel. The Afghan Robert's mother had crocheted draped over his favorite chair, the piano where I'd taught my children to play chopsticks, and happy birthday. I thought about Vincent's ultimatum, about assisted living facilities and dependency, about the difference between needing help and surrendering control. "Estate planning," I said. "I need to make some changes to my will." After I hung up, I walked to the couch and picked up my cane. It felt lighter somehow, less like a burden and more like a tool, something I could choose to use or not use, depending on what I needed to accomplish. I had a 3-mile walk ahead of me to Eleanor Hamilton's office in downtown Willowbrook Valley. 3 miles through the neighborhood where I'd lived for half a century, past houses where I'd attended baby showers and funeral luncheons, past the elementary school where I'd shaped young minds for 32 years, past the church where Robert and I had been married and where we'd said goodbye to Emma. I opened my front closet and found my best walking shoes, the comfortable black ones with good support that I'd worn to Emma's funeral. I laced them carefully, double knotting them the way Robert had taught me when we went hiking in the mountains during our early marriage. Then I picked up my purse, checked that my driver's license and insurance cards were inside, and opened the front door again. The March air was crisp but not cold, carrying the promise of spring in its wake. My crocuses nodded in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of children playing in the elementary school playground. I stepped onto my front porch, pulled the door closed behind me, and started walking. For the first time in months, I was going. Eleanor's office occupied what had once been the bank manager's suite, with tall windows that looked out onto Cedar Street and built-in bookcases that held legal volumes and family photos. Eleanor herself rose from behind a mahogany desk that had probably been here since the building's banking days, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Dorothy, it's good to see you," she said, gesturing to the comfortable chair across from her desk. "I was sorry to hear about your hip. How are you?" "Recovering. Better than some people think," I replied, settling into the chair and propping my cane against its arm. "That's actually why I'm here." Eleanor raised an eyebrow as she returned to her seat. "Oh?" I took a breath and launched into the story of the morning's events. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I described Vincent's behavior and the ultimatum about Sunset Manor. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her. "I see," she said finally. "And what would you like me to do about this?" "I want to understand my options," I said. Vincent seemed very confident that he could override my decisions if he deemed me incompetent. "Is that true?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, considering her answer carefully. "It's complicated. There are legal mechanisms that adult children can use to petition for guardianship or conservatorship if they believe a parent is unable to make sound decisions about their care or finances. But these are serious legal proceedings that require substantial evidence and court approval. It's not something that can be done lightly or quickly." "What kind of evidence?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Medical documentation of cognitive impairment, evidence of poor judgment resulting in harm to oneself or others, financial mismanagement, repeated safety incidents, that sort of thing." I thought about the past few months, my increased reliance on others for transportation, my withdrawal from social activities, my apparent helplessness with simple tasks like getting boxes from the attic. To someone looking for evidence of decline, my behavior since the hip surgery could certainly be interpreted as concerning. Vincent mentioned that I've become isolated, that I'm not driving or going out as much as I used to. I said. "Could that be used against me? Possibly, if it's part of a pattern of deteriorating judgment or inability to care for yourself. But isolation after a medical procedure, especially when it's accompanied by a period of recovery, is perfectly normal. The key question is whether you're capable of making rational decisions about your own welfare." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression intent. "Dorothy, I need to ask you some direct questions. Are you experiencing any confusion or memory problems? Any difficulty managing your finances or medications? Any concerns about your ability to live safely in your home?" I considered her questions carefully. "My mind is as clear as it's ever been. I manage my own finances, pay my own bills, take my medications correctly. The hip surgery slowed me down physically, but it didn't affect my cognitive abilities. As for living safely," I paused, thinking about Vincent's concerns. "I'm more cautious than I used to be, especially on stairs and in icy conditions." "But cautious isn't the same as incapable." Eleanor nodded. "That's what I thought. So the real question is, what do you want to do about Vincent's pressure to move to assisted living?" "I want to stay in my home," I said without hesitation. "Robert and I built our life in that house. All my memories are there. I'm not ready to give that up, and I shouldn't have to just because my son thinks it would be more convenient." "More convenient for whom?" Eleanor asked with a slight smile. The question hung in the air between us, and I realized she had identified the heart of the matter. Vincent's concerns about my safety and isolation were real, but they weren't the whole story. There was something else motivating his urgency. Something that made him willing to grab my cane and issue ultimatums rather than have a patient conversation about my needs and preferences. "Eleanor," I said slowly, "I'd like you to help me understand something. If something happened to me tomorrow, what would happen to my house and assets?" Eleanor pulled a file from her desk drawer. My file, I realized, thick with documents accumulated over years of legal advice. "Let me review your current will," she said, flipping through pages. "Yes, here it is. As it stands now, Vincent is your primary beneficiary, with smaller bequests to Patricia and David. Since Emma's death, her portion reverts to Vincent as the eldest. Your house, investments, life insurance. Vincent would inherit the bulk of your estate, and if I were Declared incompetent, Vincent is named as your power of attorney for both healthcare and financial decisions. He would have the legal authority to make decisions about your care, your living situation, and your finances. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Vincent wasn't just worried about my safety, he was protecting his inheritance. If I moved to assisted living, he could gradually take over my financial affairs under the guise of helping me manage the transition. He could sell the house, claiming it was too expensive to maintain. He could make decisions about my investments and spending, all with the legal authority I had granted him years ago when such arrangements seemed like simple prudence. I see, I said, though the knowledge felt like a weight settling in my chest. And there's no requirement that he consult me about these decisions once he has power of attorney. He's supposed to act in your best interests, Eleanor said carefully. But the definition of best interests can be subjective, especially in situations involving medical care or living arrangements. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the implications. In my effort to be responsible and prepared, I had handed Vincent the legal tools he needed to control my life. The power of attorney that had seemed like a safety net now looked more like a trap. What are my options? I asked. Eleanor set down the file and looked at me directly. You have several. First, you can revoke the current power of attorney and name someone else, or you can specify more restrictive conditions under which it would take effect. Second, you can update your will to reflect your current wishes about inheritance. Third, you can create legal safeguards that would make it more difficult for anyone to challenge your competency. What kind of safeguards? Well, we could arrange for you to undergo a comprehensive mental competency evaluation by a qualified physician, not because I think you need one, but because having recent professional documentation of your cognitive abilities would make it much harder for Vincent to claim you're incompetent. We could also establish a trust that would protect your assets regardless of any future guardianship proceedings. The idea of a trust intrigued me. How would that work? You would transfer ownership of your major assets, your house, investments, savings, into a trust that you control as trustee. You would retain complete authority over these assets during your lifetime, but they would be legally protected from interference by others. If someone tried to challenge your competency, they couldn't touch the assets in the trust without going through additional legal hurdles. Eleanor pulled out a legal pad and began sketching diagrams as she explained the concept. Think of it as building a firewall around your assets. You maintain complete control and access, but you create legal obstacles that would prevent others from taking over without very compelling evidence of incapacity. As she talked, I found myself thinking about Vincent's words from that morning. Use your legs or stay down. He had meant it as a challenge to my physical capabilities, but it had become something more. It was a choice between asserting my independence or accepting the role of helpless dependent that he wanted to assign me. There's something else we should discuss, Eleanor continued. If you're serious about protecting your autonomy, we need to think strategically about how Vincent might respond to these changes. People don't usually react well when they realize their expectations about inheritance or control are being modified. I thought about Vincent's face when I had stood up without my cane, the mixture of surprise and frustration that had crossed his features. He had expected me to remain seated, helpless, dependent on his goodwill for the return of my mobility. My defiance had clearly caught him off guard. What kind of response should I expect? I asked. That depends on Vincent's motivations. If his primary concern really is your welfare, he might be relieved to see you taking active steps to ensure your security and independence. But if his concerns are more about other factors, he might escalate his efforts to establish legal control before you can implement these protections. The implication was clear. If Vincent was primarily motivated by financial concerns, learning about my visit to Eleanor might prompt him to accelerate his timeline for having me declared incompetent. How quickly can these legal protections be put in place? I asked. The competency evaluation could be scheduled within a week or two. The trust documents would take a bit longer, maybe 3 to 4 weeks to draft and execute properly. Updating your power of attorney and will could be done more quickly, perhaps within a few days. I considered the timeline. Vincent would probably give me a few days to come to my senses about Sunset Manor before applying more pressure. If I moved quickly, I could have at least some legal protections in place before he realized what was happening. I'd like to proceed with all of it, I said. The competency evaluation, the trust, updates to the power of attorney and will. Everything. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Good. I think that's wise. Now, we need to discuss who you'd like to name as your alternate power of attorney, since you'll be removing Vincent from that role. The question caught me off guard, with Emma gone and Patricia and David living so far away. My options were limited. I thought about the people in my life who had shown genuine care for my welfare rather than their own convenience. What about Mrs. Chen, my neighbor? I asked. She's been very helpful since my surgery, and I trust her judgment. That's a possibility, though I'd recommend having a backup as well. What about Patricia or David? I shook my head. Patricia is busy with her career in Denver, and David, well, David has his own struggles. I'm not sure either of them would be better choices than Vincent when it comes to making difficult decisions. Eleanor made notes on her legal pad. We could structure it so that Mrs. Chen has authority for day-to-day decisions. But major medical or financial choices would require consultation with Patricia or David. That way, you'd have oversight without concentrating too much power in any one person. The suggestion made sense, and I found myself feeling more optimistic than I had in months, for the first time since Robert's death. I was actively planning for my future rather than simply reacting to other people's plans for me. There's one more thing we should discuss, Eleanor said, her expression growing more serious. Legal protections are important, but they're not foolproof. If Vincent is determined to pursue guardianship, he could still cause you significant stress and expense, even if he ultimately loses. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought about the question carefully. Was I prepared for a legal battle with my own son? Was I prepared for family relationships to be permanently damaged? Was I prepared to stand alone against people who claimed to be acting in my best interests? Then I thought about Vincent's face as he held my cane just out of reach, the casual cruelty of his words. The assumption that I would simply submit to his authority because I was old and needed assistance walking. Yes, I said firmly, I'm prepared for whatever comes next. Eleanor smiled and began pulling forms from her filing cabinet. Then let's get started. I'm going to give you some paperwork to review, and I'll start drafting the new documents. Can you come back Friday morning to sign the initial revisions? I'll be here, I said, standing and reaching for my cane. How are you getting home? Eleanor asked. That's quite a walk from here. I paused, realizing I hadn't thought about the return journey. The walk to downtown had taken nearly 3 hours, and my hip was already protesting. The thought of another 3-hour walk, this time uphill toward Maple Ridge Road, was daunting. I suppose I could call a taxi, I said, though the admission felt like a small defeat. Nonsense, Eleanor said, reaching for her purse. I was planning to leave early today anyway. Let me drive you home. As we walked to Eleanor's car, I found myself reflecting on the irony of the situation. Vincent had grabbed my cane to demonstrate my helplessness, but his action had prompted me to walk 3 miles across town to begin the process of securing my independence. He had tried to prove that I couldn't function without assistance, but I had just spent 2 hours making decisions that would protect my autonomy for years to come. The ride home took only 15 minutes, a stark reminder of how much effort I had invested in reaching Eleanor's office. But as we turned onto Maple Ridge Road and my house came into view, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The blue shutters and wraparound porch looked welcoming in the afternoon sunlight, and the crocuses in my front garden seemed to nod their approval as Eleanor's car pulled into my driveway. Thank you, I said as I got out of the car, for everything. Don't thank me yet, Eleanor replied with a smile. The real work is just beginning. As I watched her drive away, I realized she was right. This morning I had been Dorothy Morrison, a 70-year-old widow recovering from hip surgery, dependent on family goodwill and social services to maintain her independence. Tonight I was Dorothy Morrison, a woman with a plan. Vincent had thrown down a gauntlet, challenging me to prove my capability or accept my helplessness. He had expected me to choose helplessness. He had chosen poorly. Inside my house, I hung my jacket in the front closet and propped my cane against the hall table. My hip ached from the long walk, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from accomplishing something worthwhile rather than enduring something imposed. I looked around my living room, seeing it with new eyes. Vincent and Jennifer viewed this space as evidence of my decline. Too big, too isolated, too much for someone in my condition. But I saw something different now. I saw the piano where I had taught my children to play music. I saw the bookshelf filled with novels I had shared with students over the years. I saw the mantel displaying photos of a life well lived and relationships that had shaped me into the woman I had become. This wasn't just a house that was too big for one person. This was a home that had room for memories, space for independence, and walls strong enough to protect what mattered most. Vincent wanted me to abandon all of this for the convenience of supervised living and the security of professional care. But convenience and security weren't the most important things in life. Sometimes dignity mattered more than safety. Sometimes independence was worth the risk of being alone. I picked up the phone and dialed Mrs. Chen's number. When she answered, I could hear the smile in her voice. "Dorothy, I was just thinking about you. How was your day?" "Productive," I said, settling into Robert's chair with a cup of tea. "I walked downtown to see my lawyer." "You walked all that way?" "Goodness, that's wonderful," her genuine pleasure at my accomplishment was a stark contrast to Vincent's dismissive attitude toward my capabilities. Mrs. Chen saw my 3-mile walk as an achievement to be celebrated. Vincent would probably see it as evidence of poor judgment or reckless behavior. "Mrs. Chen," I said, "I have a favor to ask you, a rather important one." "Of course, dear. What do you need?" As I explained Eleanor's suggestion about the power of attorney arrangement, I found myself grateful for neighbors who saw strength where others saw weakness, capability where others saw limitation. Mrs. Chen listened carefully and agreed without hesitation to serve as my advocate if the need arose. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk of my living room, watching the last light fade from the sky outside my windows. Tomorrow, Vincent would probably call to check on my decision about Sunset Manor. He would expect me to have reconsidered, to have realized the wisdom of his guidance and the foolishness of my resistance. Instead, he would find that his 70-year-old mother had spent the day walking across town to hire a lawyer, arranging competency evaluations, and restructuring her estate to prevent exactly the kind of interference he was planning. I smiled, imagining his reaction. Vincent had always been a careful planner, someone who liked to control variables and minimize surprises. He wouldn't be expecting this variable. He wouldn't be prepared for this surprise, but I was just getting started. Outside, Mrs. Chen's porch light came on, and I could see her silhouette moving around her kitchen as she prepared dinner. Down the street, other houses began to glow with warm light as families gathered for evening meals. This was my neighborhood, my community, my home. I had invested 47 years of my life in these relationships and this place. Vincent could have Sunset Manor, with its scheduled activities and supervised independence. I would keep my memories, my autonomy, and my right to choose how I spent whatever years remained to me. The cane leaned against my chair, within easy reach if I needed it. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was standing on my own, 2 feet in every way that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts, new tests of my resolve. But tonight, I was home, I was independent. And I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide my future. Tonight, I was Dorothy Morrison, and I was taking my life back one step at a time. 3 days after my visit to Eleanor Hamilton's office, I was in my kitchen making breakfast when I heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Chen's garden gate closing. Through my window, I watched her cross the small patch of grass that separated our properties, a covered dish balanced in her hands and concern written across her weathered face. Mrs. Chen, whose first name was actually Lily, though we had been neighbors for 15 years before I learned that had moved to Willowbrook Valley from San Francisco after her husband's retirement. They had chosen the house next to mine specifically because of the neighborhood's reputation for stability and community spirit. After Mr. Chen died 4 years ago, Lily had become something of a surrogate grandmother to the younger families on our street. The kind of neighbor who remembered birthdays and brought soup when someone was sick, she was also. I had come to realize one of the most perceptive people I knew. Dorothy, she called through my screen door, I brought you some of that ginger tea you liked. May I come in? I opened the door to find Lily studying my face with the intensity of someone reading a complicated map. At 73, she was small and slight. With silver hair she wore in a neat bun and dark eyes that missed nothing. She had been born in Taiwan, immigrated to the United States as a young woman, and spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a second language. But her slight accent couldn't disguise the steel beneath her polite demeanor. Of course, I said, stepping aside to let her enter. You didn't need to bring anything, but I appreciate it. Lily set the dish on my kitchen counter and turned to face me. Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be offended. Tuesday morning, when your son and his wife left your house, you seemed upset, and then you walked all the way downtown. I watched you go. And I watched you come back in that lawyer's car hours later. Is everything all right? I had been dreading this conversation, though I knew it was inevitable. Lily was too observant and too caring to ignore obvious signs of distress. The question was how much to tell her, especially since I had already asked her to serve as my power of attorney. It's complicated, I said, gesturing for her to sit at the kitchen table. Vincent and Jennifer have some concerns about my living situation. Lily's expression darkened. What kind of concerns? I found myself telling her the whole story: Vincent's ultimatum about Sunset Manor, the incident with my cane, the discovery that my current power of attorney arrangement could be used against me. Lily listened without interruption, her face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table surface in a rhythm that suggested deep thought. Dorothy, she said finally, I need to tell you something. I wasn't just watching from my window Tuesday morning. I was in my garden, and I heard raised voices from your kitchen. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the tone. Your son was angry, and you were upset. When they left, Vincent slammed his car door so hard it rattled my windows. The confirmation that our argument had been audible to neighbors was embarrassing, but also oddly validating. Lily's account proved that Vincent's behavior had been aggressive enough to attract attention. There's more, Lily continued. Last month, when I was bringing you groceries, I saw Vincent in your driveway with another man, someone I didn't recognize. They were looking at your house and pointing at things: the roof, the windows, the front steps. Vincent was taking pictures with his phone. My blood ran cold. Pictures of what? Everything. The exterior, your car, even the inside when you opened the door. At the time, I thought maybe he was helping you with insurance claims or home maintenance. But now it seemed like he had been documenting evidence of the house's supposed deterioration, building a case for why I couldn't safely live here. Did you recognize the other man? I asked. Lily shook her head. No, but he had the look of someone official. Professional clothes, clipboard, that kind of bearing. Maybe an appraiser or inspector of some kind. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Vincent hadn't just been pressuring me to move to assisted living, he had been actively preparing for the transition, possibly even arranging to have the house appraised for sale. The Tuesday morning ultimatum hadn't been a spontaneous intervention. It had been the culmination of weeks or months of planning. Dorothy, Lily said gently, I think your son has been preparing to take control of your affairs for some time. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before I could answer, we were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into my driveway, through the kitchen window. I could see Vincent's sedan, and my heart rate immediately accelerated. I hadn't expected him to return so soon, and I certainly hadn't expected him to find Lily here as a witness to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Stay, I said to Lily as I heard car doors closing. Please, I think I'm going to need a witness. Lily nodded and moved her chair slightly so she would have a clear view of the front door. Her presence was immensely comforting, a reminder that I wasn't facing this situation entirely alone. Vincent's knock was sharp and impatient, the sound Of someone who expected immediate compliance. When I opened the door, I found him standing on my porch with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of frustration and barely controlled anger. Behind him, Jennifer hung back slightly, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mom," Vincent said without preamble, "we need to finish our conversation from Tuesday. Good morning to you too." "Vincent," I replied, making no move to invite them inside. "I wasn't expecting you. We called yesterday." 3 days after my visit to Eleanor Hamilton's office, I was in my kitchen making breakfast when I heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Chen's garden gate closing. Through my window, I watched her cross the small patch of grass that separated our properties, a covered dish balanced in her hands and concern written across her weathered face. Mrs. Chen, whose first name was actually Lily, though we had been neighbors for 15 years before I learned that had moved to Willowbrook Valley from San Francisco after her husband's retirement. They had chosen the house next to mine specifically because of the neighborhood's reputation for stability and community spirit. After Mr. Chen died 4 years ago, Lily had become something of a surrogate grandmother to the younger families on our street. The kind of neighbor who remembered birthdays and brought soup when someone was sick. She was also, I had come to realize, one of the most perceptive people I knew. "Dorothy," she called through my screen door, "I brought you some of that ginger tea you liked. May I come in?" I opened the door to find Lily studying my face with the intensity of someone reading a complicated map. At 73, she was small and slight. With silver hair she wore in a neat bun and dark eyes that missed nothing. She had been born in Taiwan, immigrated to the United States as a young woman, and spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a second language. But her slight accent couldn't disguise the steel beneath her polite demeanor. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. "You didn't need to bring anything, but I appreciate it." Lily set the dish on my kitchen counter and turned to face me. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be offended. Tuesday morning, when your son and his wife left your house, you seemed upset, and then you walked all the way downtown. I watched you go. And I watched you come back in that lawyer's car hours later. Is everything all right?" I had been dreading this conversation, though I knew it was inevitable. Lily was too observant and too caring to ignore obvious signs of distress. The question was how much to tell her, especially since I had already asked her to serve as my power of attorney. "It's complicated," I said, gesturing for her to sit at the kitchen table. "Vincent and Jennifer have some concerns about my living situation." Lily's expression darkened. "What kind of concerns?" I found myself telling her the whole story: Vincent's ultimatum about Sunset Manor, the incident with my cane, the discovery that my current power of attorney arrangement could be used against me. Lily listened without interruption, her face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table surface in a rhythm that suggested deep thought. "Dorothy," she said finally, "I need to tell you something. I wasn't just watching from my window Tuesday morning. I was in my garden, and I heard raised voices from your kitchen. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the tone. Your son was angry, and you were upset. When they left, Vincent slammed his car door so hard it rattled my windows. The confirmation that our argument had been audible to neighbors was embarrassing, but also oddly validating. Lily's account proved that Vincent's behavior had been aggressive enough to attract attention. "There's more," Lily continued. "Last month, when I was bringing you groceries, I saw Vincent in your driveway. I felt my temper rising, but I forced myself to remain calm. Eleanor had warned me that Vincent might try to provoke an emotional response that could later be used as evidence of instability. I use a cane because I had major surgery 3 months ago," I said evenly. "I'm isolated because I've been recovering. I'm not driving as much because my doctor recommended avoiding unnecessary trips until my hip healed completely. These aren't signs of decline, they're signs of recovery." "Recovery from what, Mom? You're 70 years old. You're not going to get better. You're only going to get worse." The words hung in the air like a slap. Vincent had just articulated what I suspected. He really believed that my age alone disqualified me from making decisions about my own life. That any physical limitation was evidence of comprehensive decline. That growing older was simply a process of inevitable deterioration. From the kitchen came the sound of a chair being pushed back, and a moment later Lily appeared in the hallway behind me. Her small frame and gentle manner might have made her seem like an unlikely ally. But the expression on her face was fierce. "Vincent Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an authority that belied her size, "I have lived next door to your mother for 15 years. I have watched her care for your father through his illness, maintain this property, contribute to this community, and face every challenge with grace and dignity. The idea that you would speak to her this way is disgraceful." Vincent looked genuinely shocked to see Lily. "Mrs. Chen, this is a family matter." I think it became a community matter when you started shouting at your mother." On her own front porch, Lily interrupted. "I think it became my business when you began treating a woman I respect like she was incompetent to manage her own affairs." Jennifer stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Mrs. Chen, we appreciate your concern, but Vincent is right, this is a family discussion. We're just trying to make sure Dorothy is safe and well cared for." By pressuring her to abandon her home, Lily's accent became more pronounced when she was angry, clipping her consonants and emphasizing each syllable. By dismissing her preferences as stubbornness, by speaking about her as if she were not standing right here, Vincent's face was now bright red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, you don't understand the full situation. My mother has been having difficulties that go beyond what you might observe as a neighbor." "What difficulties?" Lily demanded. Vincent glanced at me, then back at Lily. "She's become increasingly dependent on others for basic tasks. She can't manage the maintenance of this house. She's isolated herself socially. She's making poor decisions about her health and safety, such as walking 3 miles across town when she can barely manage the stairs in her own house." I realized Vincent had somehow learned about my trip to Eleanor's office. The knowledge was unsettling, suggesting he was monitoring my activities more closely than I had suspected. "How do you know about that?" I asked. Vincent had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "Mrs. Patterson from the bank called Jennifer. She was concerned when she saw you walking alone with your cane, especially such a long distance. She thought we should know." So Vincent had sources of information throughout the community, people who reported my activities to him under the guise of concern for my welfare. The realization was deeply disturbing, suggesting that my independence was more compromised than I had understood, but Lily was having none of it. "Let me understand this correctly," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You are concerned because Dorothy walked to town to conduct business. You consider this a sign of poor judgment." "I consider it a sign of stubbornness and poor safety awareness," Vincent replied. "She could have called for a ride. She could have asked for help. Instead, she exhausted herself trying to prove some point about her independence, the point being that she is still capable of making her own decisions and conducting her own affairs, the point being that she's too proud to accept help when she needs it." Lily looked at Vincent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to me. "Dorothy, would you like me to call someone, the police, perhaps, to address this harassment?" The suggestion clearly shocked Vincent and Jennifer. "Harassment?" Jennifer sputtered. "We're his family. We're trying to help. Help involves offering assistance and respecting the response," Lily said calmly. "What you are doing is pressuring an independent adult to make decisions she doesn't want to make, then becoming angry when she resists. In my experience, that is called harassment." Vincent took a step back, clearly recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Mom," he said, his voice forced calm, "obviously you've discussed our conversation with Mrs. Chen. I hope you've also mentioned that we're acting out of love and concern for your welfare." "I've mentioned everything," I said, "including the fact that you grabbed my cane and told me to use my legs or stay down." Vincent's face went white. "I didn't, that's not." "You're taking that out of context. What context makes that behavior acceptable?" Lily asked. Vincent looked between Lily and me, clearly realizing that his version of events was being challenged by a witness he hadn't expected. I was trying to encourage her to be more active, to not become overly dependent on assistive devices. By taking away her mobility aid, Lily's voice was incredulous. Vincent, if someone took away your car keys while you were driving, would you consider that encouragement? That's not the same thing, isn't it? Both involve removing someone's means of safe transportation. Jennifer stepped forward again, clearly trying to rescue the conversation. Dorothy, Mrs. Chen, I think we've all gotten a bit heated here. Perhaps we should take a step back and remember that we all want what's best for Dorothy's health and happiness. Do we? Lily asked pointedly. Because it seems to me that Vincent wants what's most convenient for Vincent. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Vincent opened his mouth to respond. But Lily wasn't finished. I have been watching this situation develop for weeks, she said. I have seen Vincent visit with men who take pictures of Dorothy's house. I have seen him examine her property like someone preparing for a sale. I have heard him speak about her as if she were already incapacitated. This is not the behavior of someone concerned about a parent's welfare. This is the behavior of someone preparing to take control. Vincent's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of cold calculation. Mrs. Chen, I think you're misunderstanding what you've observed. Any photographs or assessments have been for Dorothy's safety and to help us understand what modifications might be needed to make the house more accessible. Modifications such as selling it and forcing her to move elsewhere. If that's what's necessary for her safety, then yes. The admission was like a confession. Vincent had just acknowledged that he was prepared to force me out of my home if I didn't comply with his plans voluntarily. Lily looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy with determination. Dorothy, I think you need to make some phone calls. To your lawyer, certainly. But perhaps also to someone who can document this conversation. Vincent's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Chen? I am advising a friend to protect herself from someone who has just admitted to planning to force her from her home. Against her will, the standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of another car. Pastor Williams from Willowbrook Community Church climbed out of his modest sedan, carrying what appeared to be a casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression of someone responding to news of illness or crisis. Pastor Williams was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had made him beloved in the community during his 12 years leading our congregation. Robert and I had attended his church faithfully until Robert's illness made regular attendance impossible, and Pastor Williams had been a source of comfort during Robert's final months. Dorothy, he called out as he approached the porch, I heard you weren't feeling well, so I brought you some of Martha's famous chicken and rice. He paused as he took in the scene: Vincent and Jennifer standing stiffly near the door, Lily positioned protectively beside me, and the obvious tension in the air. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company. Pastor Williams, I said, grateful for another friendly face. How good of you to come. Vincent and Jennifer were just leaving. Vincent clearly wanted to continue the confrontation, but the presence of both Lily and Pastor Williams had shifted the dynamics beyond his control. He couldn't continue to pressure me aggressively in front of witnesses who were clearly sympathetic to my position. We'll talk later, Mom, he said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. When you're ready to have a rational conversation about your future. I am having rational conversations about my future, I replied. Just not the ones you want to hear. Vincent and Jennifer walked to their car in silence, their body language radiating frustration and defeat. As they drove away, Pastor Williams looked between Lily and me with obvious curiosity. Is everything all right here? He asked. Lily and I exchanged glances. It's complicated, I said finally. But yes, I think everything is going to be all right. Pastor Williams set the casserole dish on the porch table and settled into one of the wicker chairs, clearly prepared to listen if we wanted to talk. His presence was reassuring, another witness to my competence, another voice that could speak to my character and judgment if the need arose. Pastor Williams, I said, I'm glad you're here. I may need to ask you for a favor in the coming weeks. Of course, Dorothy, what can I do? I looked at Lily, who nodded encouragingly. I may need character references, people who can speak to my mental acuity, my judgment, my ability to manage my own affairs. Pastor Williams's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask for details. Dorothy, I've known you for over a decade. You've been a pillar of this community, a devoted wife and mother, and one of the most capable women I've ever met. If you need someone to attest to your character and competence, I would be honored to do so. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine respect and affection. After the confrontation with Vincent, hearing someone speak of me as capable rather than declining was deeply moving. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. As Pastor Williams left with promises to check on me regularly, Lily and I returned to the kitchen. The morning's events had left me emotionally drained but also oddly exhilarated. For the first time since Vincent's ultimatum, I felt like I wasn't facing this situation alone. Lily, I said as we sat down with fresh cups of tea, I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for this to get ugly? Because I think it's going to. Lily's smile was small but fierce. Dorothy, I have lived through war, immigration, discrimination, and the loss of everyone I loved most in this world. I am not afraid of your son's temper or his lawyers. Her confidence was infectious. In that case, I said, I think it's time to make some phone calls. The first call was to Eleanor Hamilton to report Vincent's threats and accelerate the timeline for legal protections. The second was to Dr. Fletcher to schedule the competency evaluation Eleanor had recommended. The third was to a locksmith, because I was no longer comfortable with Vincent having a key to my house. By the end of the day, I had a plan, allies, and witnesses who could speak to both my competence and Vincent's inappropriate behavior. The battle lines were drawn. And for the first time since this conflict began, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than defense. Vincent had expected me to be isolated, vulnerable, and easy to manipulate. Instead, he had discovered that I was part of a community that valued my independence and respected my right to make my own decisions. He had made a serious miscalculation, and tomorrow he was going to begin learning just how serious it was. The cane leaned against my kitchen counter, where I had left it after the morning's confrontation, but I no longer needed it to feel steady. I had something better now, the knowledge that I wasn't standing alone. That evening, after Lily had gone home and Pastor Williams had driven away with promises to keep me in his prayers, I found myself alone in my house for the first time since the confrontation with Vincent. The silence felt different now, not empty or lonely, but charged with possibility. I moved through the familiar rooms as if seeing them with new eyes, understanding for the first time that every corner held not just memories, but evidence of the life I had built and the woman I had become. I started in Robert's study, a small room at the back of the house that we had converted from a bedroom when the children grew up and moved away. The walls were lined with bookshelves that held his engineering manuals alongside my education textbooks, a physical representation of our parallel careers and shared intellectual curiosity. His desk still held the fountain pen he had used to write letters, the brass paperweight our children had given him for Father's Day in 1987, and a framed photograph of the two of us on our wedding day, looking impossibly young and hopeful. But tucked away in the bottom drawer of that desk, beneath years of tax returns and insurance documents, was something I hadn't looked at in over a decade, a leather-bound journal Robert had kept during the last year of his life. I had discovered it while going through his belongings after the funeral, filled with his careful engineer's handwriting documenting not just his physical decline, but his thoughts about our future, my future after he was gone. At the time, reading it had been too painful, too immediate. I had closed it after just a few pages and buried it beneath other papers, telling myself I would return to it when I was ready. Now, as the late afternoon sun slanted through the study windows, I pulled the journal from its hiding place and opened it to a random page. March 15th, Dorothy is worried about me driving to my doctor's appointments alone. But I think she's really worried about what happens when I can't drive at all. She's always been the stronger one, though she doesn't know it. When people look at our marriage, they see me as the provider, the protector, the one who handled the important decisions. But Dorothy was the one who held everything together. She was the one who made sure the children felt safe and loved. She was the one who created the home that made all my work meaningful. I hope she remembers that when I'm gone. I hope she doesn't let anyone convince her that she was just along for the ride. I had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound of Robert's voice speaking to me across the years. He had known somehow. He had known that people would try to diminish my contributions, would see me as the dependent spouse rather than the equal partner I had been. I turned to another entry, dated just 3 months before his death. June 3rd, Vincent stopped by today while Dorothy was at the grocery store. He wanted to talk about practical matters, what I thought Dorothy would need after I'm gone. Whether she'd be able to manage the house alone, whether we should start looking into care options for her future. I told him his mother is one of the most capable people I've ever known, but I'm not sure he was listening. He sees her age and my illness and assumes she'll be helpless without me. He doesn't see what I see: a woman who raised 4 children while working full-time, who managed our household finances better than any accountant, who has been my partner in every decision that mattered. Vincent loves his mother, but he doesn't respect her. That worries me more than my own mortality. The words hit me like a physical blow. Robert had seen this coming: Vincent's assumption of control, his dismissal of my capabilities, his confusion of care with domination, and he had been worried about it even as he lay dying. I kept reading, finding entry after entry where Robert documented not. Vincent clearly wanted to continue the confrontation, but the presence of both Lily and Pastor Williams had shifted the dynamics beyond his control. He couldn't continue to pressure me aggressively in front of witnesses who were clearly sympathetic to my position. "We'll talk later, Mom," he said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "When you're ready to have a rational conversation about your future." "I am having rational conversations about my future," I replied. "Just not the ones you want to hear." Vincent and Jennifer walked to their car in silence, their body language radiating frustration and defeat. As they drove away, Pastor Williams looked between Lily and me with obvious curiosity. "Is everything all right here?" he asked. Lily and I exchanged glances. "It's complicated," I said finally. "But yes, I think everything is going to be all right." Pastor Williams set the casserole dish on the porch table and settled into one of the wicker chairs, clearly prepared to listen if we wanted to talk. His presence was reassuring, another witness to my competence, another voice that could speak to my character and judgment if the need arose. "Pastor Williams," I said, "I'm glad you're here. I may need to ask you for a favor in the coming weeks." "Of course, Dorothy. What can I do?" I looked at Lily, who nodded encouragingly. "I may need character references, people who can speak to my mental acuity, my judgment, my ability to manage my own affairs." Pastor Williams's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask for details. "Dorothy, I've known you for over a..." September 28th. Dorothy doesn't know I'm writing this, but I need to say it somewhere. She might find it someday. If something happens to me tomorrow, she will grieve, but she will not break. She will miss me, but she will not be lost. She has been the foundation of our family for 47 years, and foundations don't crumble just because the structure above them changes. She is stronger than she knows, smarter than people give her credit for, and more capable than anyone, including herself, believes. I am not afraid to die because I know she will keep living, really living, not just surviving. I only hope she remembers this when people try to convince her otherwise. I closed the journal and sat in Robert's chair, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, exactly, though there was certainly grief in them. These were tears of recognition, of understanding something about myself that I had forgotten in the months since his death. I had been so focused on managing my physical recovery, on adapting to the practical challenges of living alone, that I had lost sight of who I was beneath the circumstances. I had let Vincent's narrative take hold that I was a woman diminished by age and loss, someone who needed guidance and protection, someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted. But Robert's words reminded me of a different truth. I was Dorothy Morrison, the woman who had earned a master's degree while raising For children, I was the person who had managed our family's finances for nearly 5 decades, who had navigated Robert's illness with competence and grace, who had built a career that touched hundreds of young lives. I was someone who had faced challenges before and emerged stronger, someone who had made difficult decisions and lived with the consequences. Vincent saw an old woman with a cane who needed to be managed. Robert had seen a partner, a problem solver, a person of substance and capability. Which version was true? I stood up from Robert's chair and walked to the bookshelf where I kept photo albums from our family life. The earliest album documented our wedding and honeymoon, filled with pictures of 2 young people who thought they knew what life had in store for them. As I flipped through the pages, I could trace the evolution of our story: the birth of our children, the purchase of our first house, family vacations and holiday celebrations, graduations and weddings. But what struck me most were the photographs that showed me in action. Here was a picture of me standing in front of my 3rd-grade classroom, pointing to a map while 28 young faces looked up at me with attention and respect. Here was another of me at Vincent's high school graduation, not sitting passively in the audience but pinning his Honor Society cord to his gown, my face bright with pride and accomplishment. There were pictures of me organizing Emma's wedding reception, directing vendors, and coordinating details with the efficiency of a military commander. Photos of me presenting a paper at an education conference, standing confidently at a podium while colleagues listened to my research on reading comprehension. Images of me leading a community fundraising committee, surrounded by other women who had chosen me to guide their efforts. These photographs told a different story than the one Vincent was trying to write. They showed a woman who had spent 70 years being competent, responsible, and effective. They documented someone who had been trusted with important tasks and had delivered results. They proved that my current need for a walking aid was an adaptation to a specific physical challenge, not evidence of global decline. I carried the photo albums to the living room and spread them out on the coffee table, creating a visual timeline of my life's accomplishments. As I studied the images, I began to understand something that Vincent either couldn't or wouldn't see. Using a cane didn't make me incompetent any more than wearing glasses made me blind. Physical adaptation was a sign of intelligence, not weakness. The more I looked at these photographs, the more clearly I could see the pattern of my life. I had always been someone who assessed situations, made plans, and took action. When our first child was born with a heart defect, I had researched specialists and treatment options until I found the best possible care. When Robert lost his job during the recession of the early 1980s, I had increased my teaching hours and taken on tutoring work to keep our family financially stable. When our neighbor Mrs. Kowalski became widowed and isolated, I had organized a support network that lasted for the final 15 years of her life. In every crisis, in every challenge, in every situation that required leadership or problem solving, I had stepped forward. I had been the person others relied on, the one who found solutions when problems seemed insurmountable. So why had I allowed Vincent to convince me that I was now helpless? The answer was uncomfortable but clear. Because I had been grieving, vulnerable, and physically compromised. Because I had confused temporary limitation with permanent decline. Because I had allowed my sense fears to become my own reality. But grief doesn't erase competence. Physical challenges don't eliminate intelligence. And age doesn't automatically disqualify someone from making their own decisions. I thought about Eleanor Hamilton's words from our meeting earlier that week. The key question is whether you're capable of making rational decisions about your own welfare. As I sat surrounded by evidence of a lifetime of rational decision-making, the answer seemed obvious. I was not only capable of making decisions about my welfare, I was the person best qualified to make them. Vincent's urgency about moving me to Sunset Manor wasn't based on any sudden decline in my abilities. It was based on his own discomfort with uncertainty, his need to control variables he couldn't predict. He wanted me safely contained in a supervised environment, not because I needed supervision, but because it would relieve him of the anxiety of wondering what might happen. But uncertainty was part of life at any age. Risk was part of independence. And the possibility of future challenges didn't justify surrendering present autonomy. September 28th. Dorothy doesn't know I'm writing this, but I need to say it somewhere. She might find it someday. If something happens to me tomorrow, she will grieve, but she will not break. She will miss me, but she will not be lost. She has been the foundation of our family for 47 years, and foundations don't crumble just because the structure above them changes. She is stronger than she knows, smarter than people give her credit for, and more capable than anyone, including herself, believes. I am not afraid to die because I know she will keep living, really living, not just surviving. I only hope she remembers this when people try to convince her otherwise. I closed the journal and sat in Robert's chair, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, exactly. Though there was certainly grief in them, these were tears of recognition, of understanding something about myself that I had forgotten in the months since his death. I had been so focused on managing my physical recovery, on adapting to the practical challenges of living alone, that I had lost sight of who I was beneath the circumstances. I had let Vincent's narrative take hold that I was a woman diminished by age and loss, someone who needed guidance and protection, someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted. But Robert's words reminded me of a different truth. I was Dorothy Morrison, the woman who had earned a master's degree while raising 4 children. I was the person who had managed our family's finances for nearly 5 decades, who had navigated Robert's illness with competence and grace, who had built a career that touched hundreds of young lives. I was someone who had faced challenges before and emerged stronger, someone who had made difficult decisions and lived with the consequences. Vincent saw an old woman with a cane who needed to be managed. Robert had seen a partner, a problem solver, a person of substance and capability. Which version was true? I stood up from Robert's chair and walked to the bookshelf where I kept photo albums from our family life. The earliest album documented our wedding and honeymoon, filled with pictures of 2 young people who thought they knew what life had in store for them. As I flipped through the pages, I could trace the evolution of our story: the birth of our children, the purchase of our first house, family vacations and holiday celebrations, graduations and weddings. But what struck me most were the photographs that showed me in action. Here was a picture of me standing in front of my 3rd grade classroom, pointing to a map while 28 young faces looked up at me with attention and respect. Here was another of me at Vincent's high school graduation, not sitting passively in the audience but pinning his Honor Society cord to his gown, my face bright with pride and accomplishment. There were pictures of me organizing Emma's wedding reception, directing vendors, and coordinating details with the efficiency of a military commander. Photos of me presenting a paper at an education conference, standing confidently at a podium while colleagues listened to my research on reading comprehension. Images of me leading a community fundraising committee, surrounded by other women who had chosen me to guide their efforts. These photographs told, "Patricia," I said, "let me ask you something. When you make decisions about your career, your living situation, or your personal life, do you expect David or Vincent to override those decisions if they disagree with your choices?" There was a pause. "That's different, Mom. I don't have the same challenges you're facing." "What challenges specifically?" Another pause, longer this time. "Well, you're living alone now. And you're older, and you've had health problems." "I live alone by choice. I'm older but mentally sharp, and I had 1 medical procedure with a good outcome. Or any of those reasons to surrender my right to make my own decisions, Mom." "Vincent isn't trying to take away your rights. He's trying to make sure you're safe, by pressuring me to move out of my home against my will, by grabbing my cane to prove a point about my helplessness, by having my activities reported to him by people in the community." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we had been disconnected. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice quieter and more uncertain. "He grabbed your cane." I described the incident, including Vincent's words, and the presence of Lily as a witness. As I talked, I could hear Patricia's breathing change, becoming more rapid and shallow. "Mom, I didn't know about that. Vincent told me you were being unreasonable about getting help, but he didn't mention. He didn't say he had taken your cane. What else didn't he mention?" Patricia, another long pause. "I don't know. Maybe I should have called you directly instead of just accepting his version of things. This was the opening I had been hoping for. Patricia, I want you to know that I'm taking steps to ensure my safety and independence. I've been working with my lawyer to update my legal documents and arrange for appropriate safeguards. I'm scheduling a competency evaluation to document my mental acuity. And I'm building a support network with neighbors and community members who can assist me when needed. That sounds reasonable, Patricia said slowly. Vincent made it sound like you were just being stubborn and refusing all help. I'm refusing help that comes with conditions I find unacceptable, but I'm actively seeking help that allows me to maintain my autonomy and dignity. Patricia was quiet for several minutes. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming more thoughtful and less anxious. Mom, can I ask you something? Are you happy living in the house, not whether it's practical or safe, but whether it makes you happy? The question caught me off guard. No one had asked about my happiness, not Vincent, not Jennifer, not even the well-meaning friends who worried about my isolation. They had all focused on safety, practicality, and risk management, but Patricia was asking about something more fundamental. Yes, I said, and the certainty in my voice surprised me. I am happy here. This house holds 47 years of my life with your father. It's where I feel most like myself, most connected to the person I've always been. Moving to assisted living might be safer or more convenient, but it wouldn't make me happy. Then maybe that should be part of the conversation, Patricia said. Maybe Vincent is so focused on protecting you that he's forgotten to consider what you actually want. As we talked, I felt something shifting in my relationship with Patricia, for the first time in years. She was speaking to me as an adult consulting another adult rather than a concerned child managing an aging parent. The difference was subtle but profound. Patricia, I said as our conversation drew to a close, I may need you to be a witness to my competence in the coming weeks. Not to take sides against Vincent, but to speak honestly about your observations of my mental abilities and judgment. Of course, Mom. And I'm sorry I didn't call you first before accepting Vincent's account of things. That wasn't fair to you. After we hung up, I felt a new sense of clarity about the situation. Vincent's campaign to control my living situation was based on selective information and biased interpretation. He was presenting himself as the reasonable family member protecting an incompetent parent, when the reality was more complex and less flattering to his motivations. But I now had allies: Lily, Pastor Williams, Eleanor, and potentially Patricia, who could speak to my actual capabilities rather than Vincent's assumptions about my limitations. More importantly, I had Robert's words reminding me of who I had always been, and my own memories providing evidence of a lifetime of competent decision-making. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, climbing the stairs slowly but steadily, my hand on the rail for security rather than necessity. At the top, I paused to look back down the staircase that Vincent claimed was too steep for me to navigate safely. The stairs were the same height and configuration they had been for 47 years. I had climbed them thousands of times, through pregnancy and illness, while carrying children and laundry and hope for the future. They were not too steep. I was not too frail. And I was not too old to defend my right to live as I chose. In my bedroom, I opened the jewelry box where I kept the few pieces of real value Robert had given me over the years. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of velvet, was my wedding ring. I had stopped wearing it 6 months after Robert's death, when the constant reminder of his absence became too painful to bear. Now I slipped it back onto my finger, feeling its familiar weight settle against my skin. Not because I was living in the past, but because I was reclaiming the part of myself that had been Robert's equal partner, his intellectual companion, his trusted advisor. That woman had never needed anyone else to make her decisions. That woman had been capable, confident, and respected. That woman was still here, still present, still competent to manage her own life. Tomorrow I would continue building the legal and social framework that would protect my independence. But tonight, I was simply Dorothy Morrison, sitting in the bedroom I had shared with my husband for nearly 5 decades, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and decisions well made. Vincent could challenge my competence, but he couldn't change my history. He could question my judgment, but he couldn't erase my accomplishments. He could try to control my future, but he couldn't diminish the strength I had built over 7 decades of facing challenges and emerging victorious. I turned off the light and settled into sleep with a peace I hadn't felt since before Robert's illness. For the first time in months, I wasn't worried about what tomorrow might bring. I was ready for whatever came next, because I finally remembered who I was fighting for. I was fighting for Dorothy Morrison, teacher, wife, mother, problem solver, survivor, and Dorothy Morrison had never lost a battle that truly mattered. She wasn't about to start now. 6 weeks after Vincent grabbed my cane and told me to use my legs or stay down, I stood in the same kitchen where that confrontation had taken place, but everything had changed. The morning sun streamed through windows I had washed myself the day before, casting warm light across countertops that no longer felt like evidence of my decline but proof of my persistence. In my hand was a letter that would arrive at Vincent's office within the hour, delivering news he was not prepared to receive. The competency evaluation had taken place 3 weeks earlier, conducted by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geriatric psychiatrist Eleanor had recommended. Dr. Martinez had spent 4 hours with me, administering cognitive tests, reviewing my medical history, observing my daily routines, and asking probing questions about my decision-making processes. Her report, now part of my legal file, contained language that would have made Robert proud. Mrs. Morrison demonstrates exceptional cognitive function for an individual of any age. Her memory, reasoning abilities, and judgment are not only intact, but superior. She shows clear understanding of her circumstances, realistic assessment of her capabilities and limitations, and sound decision-making regarding her future care. Her choice to remain in her home is based on rational evaluation of available options and personal values. There is no evidence of cognitive impairment that would justify questioning her capacity to make independent decisions about her living situation, finances, or medical care. Eleanor had filed the evaluation with the court as a preemptive measure, creating an official record that would make any future competency challenges extremely difficult to pursue. But more importantly, the process had given me scientific confirmation of what I already knew. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been. The trust documents had been finalized and executed, transferring ownership of my major assets into a legal structure that protected them from interference while allowing me complete control. Lily Chen was now my primary power of attorney, with Patricia serving as secondary decision-maker for major medical or financial choices. The changes were irrevocable without my explicit consent, and a court order, something that would require evidence of incapacity that Dr. Martinez's evaluation made nearly impossible to obtain. But perhaps the most significant change was one that couldn't be documented in legal papers or medical reports. I had remembered who I was. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of reclaiming pieces of myself that I had allowed others to diminish or dismiss. Each day brought small victories: cooking a complex meal without assistance, driving to the grocery store in moderate traffic, organizing my finances for the upcoming tax season. Each accomplishment reinforced my confidence and challenged the narrative Vincent had tried to impose. I had also made changes to my daily routine that addressed his legitimate concerns while preserving my independence. I now wore a medical alert device that could summon help with the push of a button. I had installed grab bars in the bathroom and improved lighting on the stairs. I had arranged for grocery delivery on days when my hip was particularly stiff. And I had resumed driving only during daylight hours and good weather conditions. These modifications weren't admissions of defeat, they were examples of intelligent adaptation. They proved that I could assess my limitations honestly and take appropriate precautions without surrender. In my autonomy, the doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the front window, I could see a delivery truck, and my heart rate quickened slightly. Today was the day Vincent would receive my letter, and I expected his response to be swift and intense. The delivery man handed me a certified envelope addressed in Vincent's familiar handwriting. And the transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of reclaiming pieces of myself that I had allowed others to diminish or dismiss. Each day brought small victories: cooking a complex meal without assistance, driving to the grocery store in moderate traffic, organizing my finances for the upcoming tax season. Each accomplishment reinforced my confidence and challenged the narrative Vincent had tried to impose. I had also made changes to my daily routine that addressed his legitimate concerns while preserving my independence. I now wore a medical alert device that could summon help with the push of a button. I had installed grab bars in the bathroom and improved lighting on the stairs. I had arranged for grocery delivery on days when my hip was particularly stiff. And I had resumed driving only during daylight hours and good weather conditions. These modifications weren't admissions of defeat, they were examples of intelligent adaptation. They proved that I could assess my limitations honestly and take appropriate precautions without surrender. In my autonomy, the doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the front window, I could see a delivery truck, and my heart rate quickened slightly. Today was the day Vincent would receive my letter, and I expected his response to be swift and intense. The delivery man handed me a certified envelope addressed in Vincent's familiar handwriting. And I knew my prediction had been correct. I signed for the package and carried it to the kitchen table, where I opened it with the same letter opener I had used to read Robert's final insurance policies. Inside was a single sheet of legal letterhead from Peterson, Walsh & Associates, the law firm Vincent had apparently retained to contest my recent legal changes. The letter was formal and threatening, but also revealed more about Vincent's state of mind than he probably intended. Dear Mrs. Morrison, we represent your son, Vincent Morrison, regarding his concerns about recent changes to your estate planning and power of attorney arrangements. Mr. Morrison has informed us that these changes were made without family consultation and may not reflect your true wishes or best interests. We respectfully request that you agree to an independent psychiatric evaluation to ensure that your recent legal decisions were made with full mental capacity and without undue influence from parties who may benefit from your modified arrangements. If you decline this evaluation, we will have no choice but to petition the court for a formal competency hearing and request temporary guardianship to protect your interests while these matters are raised. We hope this situation can be resolved amicably and in your best interests. Sincerely, James Peterson, Esq. I read the letter twice, noting both its threats and its weaknesses. Vincent's lawyers were fishing, hoping I would voluntarily submit to an evaluation that might produce different results than Dr. Martinez's assessment. The threat of a court petition was real but not particularly frightening, given the legal groundwork Eleanor and I had established. More telling was the letter's assumption that my recent decisions must have been made under undue influence. Vincent couldn't conceive that I might have acted independently, based on my own analysis of the situation. In his mind, someone else must have manipulated me into defying his plans. I was still studying the letter when the phone rang. Vincent's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, wanting to project calm control rather than anxious reactivity. Hello, Vincent. Mom. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. I assume you received the letter from my attorney. I did. It was illuminating. This isn't a joke, Mom. You've made some very serious decisions without consulting your family. We have legitimate concerns about whether you're being manipulated by people who have financial interests in your affairs. I almost laughed at the irony. Vincent was accusing others of manipulating me for financial gain while simultaneously trying to force me into assisted living so he could control my assets. Vincent, I said calmly, I consulted the only family member whose opinion I value myself, and I'm not being manipulated by anyone. I'm finally making decisions based on my own needs and preferences rather than other people's convenience. Other people's convenience. His voice rose sharply. Mom, everything I've done has been for your safety and well-being. I've spent weeks researching care options, visiting facilities, talking to professionals about your needs. How is that about my convenience? You researched options I never asked you to research. You visited facilities I never expressed interest in seeing. You talked to professionals about decisions I never asked for help making. You created a problem that didn't exist so you could solve it in the way that made you most comfortable. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if Vincent was trying to control his temper or formulate a new argument. "Mom," he said finally, his voice forced calm. "I understand that you're angry about the way our last conversation went. I admit I could have handled things better, but that doesn't change the fact that you're making decisions that could put you at risk." "What risk, specifically?" "Living alone at your age, in a house that's too big and difficult to maintain, without adequate support systems or safety measures." "Vincent, I have a medical alert system, supportive neighbors, regular medical care, and legal protections that ensure my wishes will be respected. I have grocery delivery when I need it, transportation alternatives when driving isn't advisable, and professional help with home maintenance. What additional safety measures do you think I need?" Another long pause. "Professional supervision, medical staff on site, emergency response capabilities that don't depend on neighbors or alert systems. In other words, institutional care. In a quality facility that specializes in." "Vincent, stop," I interrupted him gently but firmly. "We've been having the same argument for weeks, and we're not going to resolve it today. You want me to move to assisted living because it would make you feel better about my safety. I want to stay in my home because it makes me feel better about my autonomy. These are fundamentally different priorities, and one of us has to be disappointed." "But Mom, the difference is that I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of this decision. You'll feel better if I'm in supervised care, but I'll feel diminished and defeated. My happiness has to count for something in this equation." Vincent was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its argumentative edge. "Mom, I can't stop worrying about you. Every time my phone rings, I wonder if it's going to be news that something terrible has happened. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about you falling down the stairs or having a medical emergency with no one around to help." For the first time in weeks, I heard genuine emotion in Vincent's voice rather than frustrated control. His fear was real, even if his response to it was problematic. "Vincent," I said gently, "I understand that fear. I really do. But you can't protect me from every possible risk. And trying to do so is making both of us miserable. I could have a medical emergency in assisted living just as easily as at home. I could fall in a facility bathroom just as easily as on my own stairs. Safety isn't about eliminating all risk, it's about managing risk in a way that preserves what makes life worth living." Another long silence. "Mom, I don't want to fight with you. I love you, and I'm trying to do what's best for you. Then respect my right to decide what's best for myself." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had planted roses in the early years of our marriage. Some of those original bushes were still blooming 47 springs later, having survived droughts and harsh winters through careful tending and stubborn resilience. I understood now why Vincent's concern felt so suffocating. He loved me, but his love was tangled up with his need to control outcomes, to prevent any possibility of loss or suffering. He couldn't accept that some things, aging, illness, death, were beyond his management, so he focused on the things he could control: where I lived, how I spent my time, who made decisions about my care. But love that required the surrender of autonomy wasn't really love, it was a form of possession disguised as protection. The doorbell rang again, and this time I found Lily on my front porch, carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression she got when she had something important to discuss. "Dorothy," she said, "I hope you don't mind my dropping by, but I wanted to check on you. I saw the delivery truck earlier, and I wondered if it might be related to your situation with Vincent." I invited her in and showed her the lawyer's letter. Lily read it carefully, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. "He's not going to give up easily," she said finally. "No, he's not. But I'm ready for whatever comes next." Lily studied my face with the intensity of someone reading a complex map. "You seem different than you did a few weeks ago. More settled, I suppose." I am different. I remembered who I was before all this started. We spent the afternoon going through my legal documents, with Lily asking detailed questions about her role as power of attorney and the procedures she would need to follow if medical decisions became necessary. Her thoroughness and competence were reassuring. I had chosen well when I asked her to serve as my advocate. As evening approached, Lily prepared to leave, but she paused at the front door with a question I hadn't expected. "Dorothy, may I ask you something personal? Are you afraid?" I considered her question carefully. Of Vincent's legal threats? No. Of the possibility that something might happen to me while I'm living alone? Sometimes, but I'm more afraid of losing myself than I am of losing my life. Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense. Good. Fear of loss shouldn't be allowed to create actual loss. That evening, I called Patricia to update her on Vincent's lawyer's letter and the conversation we had shared. Patricia listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions. "Mom," she said when I finished, "I need to tell you something. Vincent called me yesterday to ask if I would support a family intervention to convince you to reconsider assisted living. I told him I wouldn't participate unless I could speak with you directly about your wishes and see the legal documents you've prepared." What did he say to that? He got angry. He said I was being manipulated by your lawyer and that I wasn't considering the family's long-term interests. And what did you say? Patricia was quiet for a moment. I told him that your interests were the family's interests, and that maybe he needed to think about why he was so invested in overriding your clearly stated preferences. Her words filled me with gratitude and pride. Patricia had found the courage to challenge Vincent's assumptions and assert her own judgment about the situation. Patricia, thank you. That means more to me than you know. Mom, I want you to know that David feels the same way. I called him after talking to Vincent, and he said he couldn't imagine trying to force you out of your home against your will. He thinks Vincent is letting his anxiety make decisions that should be based on your actual needs and wishes. So Vincent was not only losing his legal battle, he was losing the family consensus he had assumed would support his position. Patricia and David had both recognized that love required respecting my autonomy rather than overriding it. 3 days later, Eleanor called with news that Vincent's lawyers had withdrawn their petition for a competency hearing. They had apparently realized that Dr. Martinez's evaluation, combined with my comprehensive legal protections, made their case unwinnable. He may try again in the future, Eleanor warned. But for now, you're secure. The trust protects your assets. The power of attorney arrangement ensures your wishes will be respected. And the competency evaluation creates a legal presumption of your mental capacity that would be very difficult to overcome. That afternoon, I walked to downtown Willowbrook Valley again, not because I needed to conduct legal business, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. The 3-mile journey that had seemed so daunting 6 weeks earlier now felt manageable, even pleasant. My hips still ached by the time I reached Cedar Street, but the discomfort was tolerable and temporary. I stopped at Murphy's Cafe, where Robert and I used to have breakfast on Saturday mornings, and ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah who had served us many times over the years, recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Morrison, it's so good to see you out and about. How are you doing?" "I'm doing very well, thank you. Better than I have in months, actually." As I sat in the booth where Robert and I had shared countless conversations about our children, our dreams, and our plans for retirement, I felt his presence in a way I hadn't experienced since his death. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a continuing influence on my understanding of who I was and what I valued. Robert had believed in my strength even when I doubted it myself. He had trusted my judgment even when others questioned it. He had loved me not despite my independence but because of it. Vincent's attempt to control my life had forced me to remember that love and respect were inseparable. That true care required honoring the other person's right to make their own choices, even when those choices involved risk or uncertainty. I finished my pie and coffee and began the walk home, taking my time and enjoying the familiar sights of the community where I had spent most of my adult life. The elementary school where I had taught was preparing for dismissal. and I could hear children's voices echoing from the playground. The library displayed a banner advertising the summer reading program I had helped design during my teaching years. The small park where we had taken our children to feed ducks still hosted young families on warm afternoons. This was my place, my community, my home. I belonged here not as a burden to be managed but as a contributing member with value and worth. By the time I reached Maple Ridge Road, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains that ringed Willowbrook Valley. My house came into view, blue shutters freshly painted, garden blooming with spring flowers, porch light already glowing. In welcome, Lily was working in her own garden and waved as I approached. "How was your walk?" she called. "Perfect," I replied, and meant it. Inside my house, I made dinner for myself, not a simple meal that required minimal preparation, but the kind of complex dish I used to cook for Robert and the children. As I chopped vegetables and adjusted seasonings, I felt the satisfaction that comes from creating something nourishing and beautiful with your own hands. I ate at the kitchen table where Vincent had tried to convince me I was helpless, surrounded by the evidence of my continued competence, bills I had paid, correspondence I had written, decisions I had made and implemented successfully. After dinner, I called Vincent one final time. "Hello, Mom." His voice was subdued, lacking the aggressive certainty that had characterized our previous conversations. "Hello, Vincent. I wanted to let you know that I received word from Eleanor Hamilton that your lawyers have withdrawn their petition." "Yes, they advised me that pursuing a competency challenge would be unlikely to succeed given the documentation you've assembled. I also wanted to tell you that I understand why you were worried about me. And I appreciate that your concerns came from love, even when your methods were problematic." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, I still think you're taking unnecessary risks by staying in that house alone. And I still think those risks are mine to take. But Vincent, I also want you to know that you're welcome in my life and in my home, as long as you can accept that it's my life and my home to manage." "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means you can visit as my son who loves me and enjoys my company. You can offer advice when I ask for it. You can provide assistance when I request it. But you can't make decisions for me or pressure me to make choices I don't want to make. And if I can't accept those conditions," I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would either repair our relationship or damage it permanently. "Then you'll have chosen to remove yourself from my life, and I'll respect that choice the same way I expect you to respect mine." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of history and the weight of consequences neither of us had fully anticipated. "Mom," Vincent said finally, his voice softer than it had been in weeks, "I don't want to lose you." "Then don't try to control me. Love me as I am, where I am, making the choices I make. That's the only way you'll keep me." We talked for another 30 minutes, and while we didn't resolve all our differences, we began the process of rebuilding our relationship on terms that honored both his love and my autonomy. It would take time, patience, and probably some setbacks. But for the first time since he had grabbed my cane, I felt hopeful about our future. After we hung up, I sat in Robert's chair in the living room, looking around at the space that had been threatened and was now secured, the piano where I had taught my children to play music, the bookshelf filled with novels I had shared with students over the years, the mantel displaying photos of a life well lived and relationships that had shaped me into the woman I had become. This wasn't just a house that was too big for one person. This was a home that had room for memories, space for independence, and walls strong enough to protect what mattered most. I picked up my cane from where it leaned against the chair not because I needed it to feel steady, but because it had become a symbol of adaptation rather than limitation. Intelligence rather than weakness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that age and physical limitation didn't disqualify someone from living with dignity and purpose. But tonight, I was simply Dorothy Morrison, sitting in the home I had chosen to defend, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and battles well won. Vincent had told me to use my legs or stay down. I had chosen to stand up, walk away, and build a life on my own terms, and I had never felt prouder of any decision I had ever made. The porch light glowed steady and warm, welcoming me home to the life I had fought to keep. The independence I had refused to surrender. In the future, I would continue to write in my own hand, one careful, deliberate step at a time. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky over Willowbrook Valley, and inside, Dorothy Morrison settled into peaceful sleep, knowing that she had reclaimed not just her home, but herself. The cane rested beside her bed, ready when needed, ignored when not, a tool rather than a symbol, a choice rather than a sentence. Just like everything else in the life she had chosen to keep living on her own magnificent terms. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.